the final desperate months of World War II, a dark secret lay buried in the dense forests of occupied France and Germany. While the front lines moved with the thunder of tanks and the roar of thousands of men, a different kind of war was being fought in the shadows, a war of elite sabotage and silent insertion. But for the men of the Special Air Service, the SAS, the shadows had turned into a death trap. This is the story of the Lost Patrols. As Allied forces liberated town after town, they began to hear whispers from locals about the men who fell from the clouds. These were SAS teams, small 4- or 5-man units dropped behind enemy lines to blow up railway tracks and ambush Nazi reinforcements. They were ghosts, highly trained and deeply feared. But many of these ghosts had vanished without a trace. In the autumn of 1944, as the SAS searched for their missing brothers, they uncovered a horrifying reality. Near the village of Verrières and deep within the woods of the Vosges Mountains, they found them. Not in battle and not in prisoners of war camps. They found them in shallow, unmarked mass graves. The bodies told a story of absolute depravity. These men hadn't died in combat. They had been captured, stripped of their uniforms, and subjected to the Commando Order, a secret decree issued by Adolf Hitler himself. The Kommando Befehl stated that any Allied commando, even those in proper uniform, was to be slaughtered to the last man upon capture. They were to be handed over to the Gestapo, interrogated under torture, and executed in secret. Rare archival accounts describe the grim scene as SAS search teams exhumed the bodies of their comrades. They found men who had been blindfolded and shot in the back of the head. Some still had the wires of the Gestapo's torture instruments around their wrists. Among the victims were the men of Operation Bullbasket and Operation Leuthen, brave soldiers who expected the protection of the Geneva Convention, only to be met with the cold steel of a Nazi firing squad. For the survivors of the SAS, this wasn't just a war crime, it was a personal betrayal of the code of a soldier. Paddy Mayne, the legendary and volatile commander of the SAS, looked at the graves of his men and felt a cold, burning fury. These weren't anonymous casualties of war. They were his friends, his patrols, his family. As the official war drew to a close in May 1945 and the world began to celebrate with champagne and parades, the SAS men did not join the party. While the regular army prepared to go home, a small elite group stayed behind in the ruins of the Reich. They looked at the lists of the missing and the names of the Gestapo officers responsible for the Commando Order. The official mission was over, but for the SAS, a new, unofficial war had just begun. They were no longer saboteurs, they were hunters. They made a silent vow. They would not leave Europe until every man involved in the murder of the lost patrols had been tracked down. The war was over for the world, but for the hunters of the SAS, the reckoning was only just beginning. By May 1945, the guns across Europe had fallen silent. But for a hand-picked group of SAS veterans, the peace was a lie. As the rest of the British Army began the long process of packing up and heading home, a shadowy unit was being formed in the ruins of occupied Germany. Officially, they were the SAS War Crimes Investigation Team. Unofficially, they were a pack of wolves tasked with a mission the British government barely wanted to acknowledge. This was the birth of the secret unit behind Operation Loyola. Led by Major Bill Barkworth, a man possessed by a quiet, lethal determination, the unit consisted of just a few dozen men. They were not lawyers or desk-bound investigators. They were hardened Special Forces operators who had spent the war behind enemy lines. They knew how the Nazis thought because they had been hunted by them for years. Now the roles were reversed. The headquarters of this secret unit was as unconventional as its mission. Operating out of a requisitioned villa in the heart of Germany, the team refused to follow the slow bureaucratic red tape of the official war crimes commissions. They knew that if they waited for the politicians, the killers would vanish into the chaos of post-war Europe. Thousands of SS officers were already stripping off their black uniforms, burning their ID papers, and blending into the millions of refugees flooding the roads. Barkworth's men adopted a by-any-means-necessary approach. They didn't wait for warrants. They drove through the shattered streets of German cities in captured Nazi vehicles, often wearing a mix of civilian clothes and British battle dress to move unnoticed. They utilized a network of informants ranging from liberated forced laborers to disillusioned German secretaries who had seen too much. The secret unit's greatest weapon was the Black List. This was a growing ledger of names, Gestapo agents, SS guards, and local collaborators who had been present at the execution sites of SAS patrols. But finding a name was one thing, finding a ghost was another. The team discovered that many of their targets had assumed the identities of dead soldiers. To catch them, the SAS men became forensic detectives. They cross-referenced captured German transport logs with food ration cards and hospital records. There was a haunting tension to their work. In the day, they were investigators, meticulously piecing together the final moments of their murdered comrades. At night, they became the hunters. They would burst into remote farmhouses or basement apartments in the middle of the night, dragging suspects out of bed before they could reach for a Luger or a cyanide pill. The British High Command was increasingly nervous about Barkworth's unit. There were whispers that the SAS were not just looking for evidence, but for street-level justice. Yet Barkworth remained focused. He knew that for the families of the lost patrols back in England and France, there could be no peace without the truth. Operation Loyola was a race against time and a race against silence. The secret unit operated in a gray zone of morality and law, fueled by the memory of the shallow graves they had uncovered in the woods. They were the last soldiers of a finished war, standing in the shadows of a broken empire, ensuring that the commando order would be the last thing the killers would ever answer for. The hunt was no longer a military objective. It was a debt of honor that had to be paid in blood and iron. The search for the killers of Operation Bullbasket led the SAS hunters deep into the dark, labyrinthine heart of the Black Forest. In the summer of 1945, this ancient woodland was no longer a place of folklore. It was a sprawling hideout for the werewolves, die-hard Nazis who refused to surrender, and high-ranking Gestapo officers who had vanished into the mountain mist. Among the shadows of the towering pines, the SAS were looking for a man who had become a ghost, the officer responsible for the cold-blooded execution of 31 SAS soldiers. This chapter of the hunt was a psychological game of cat and mouse. The SAS team, led by the relentless Major Barkworth, moved through remote alpine villages where the local population remained fiercely silent. In these isolated communities, the war had not truly ended. The locals still looked at Allied uniforms with a mix of defiance and terror. The Nazi war criminals they sought were no longer wearing swastikas. They had transformed. The man who had ordered the massacre was now rumored to be living as a humble forest worker, a ghost blending into the rugged landscape.
The SAS used snatch squads to infiltrate these villages under the cover of darkness. They didn't arrive with a convoy of tanks. They arrived in a single dusty civilian car, moving like the partisans they had once trained. Their primary lead was a captured German stenographer who had broken under interrogation, providing a vague description of a villa hidden deep in the forest near Gaggenau. The tension in the Black Forest was suffocating. Every rustle of the trees could have been a sniper, every closed door hidden a fugitive. The SAS men, living on rations and sleeping in their vehicles, began to feel the weight of the mission. They weren't just looking for a criminal, they were walking through the graveyard of their own regiment's history. They found the site where their comrades had been led into the trees, forced to dig their own graves, and shot. Standing on that soil changed the tone of the mission from an investigation to a reckoning. Barkworth's team began to use phantom tactics. They would spread rumors in a village that the SAS had a list of every person who helped the Gestapo. They waited for the panic to set in. Eventually, someone always broke. A disgruntled local, a fearful priest, or a former lover would whisper a name. The breakthrough came when they tracked a specific shipment of high-quality tobacco, a luxury rare in post-war Germany, to a secluded cabin high on a ridge. They watched the cabin for 3 days through binoculars, observing a man who walked with a military gait despite his tattered civilian clothes. This was the ghost of the Black Forest. In a lightning-fast midnight raid, the SAS burst through the door. There was no grand battle, only a terrified man reaching for a false passport. When Barkworth stood over him, he didn't see a powerful officer of the Reich. He saw a coward who had hidden behind a forest of secrets. The ghost had been caught. But as they led him away in irons, the SAS knew that this was just one man. The forest held many more ghosts, and the hunt was far from over. The reckoning was moving from the woods to the interrogation rooms, where the truth would finally be dragged into the light.
The hunt had moved from the mud of the forest into the cold, damp interrogation rooms of occupied Germany. By late 1945, the SAS War Crimes Investigation Team had filled their ledgers with names. But now came the most difficult part, extracting the truth. This was justice in the shadows, a world of flickering light bulbs, heavy cigarette smoke, and the quiet, terrifying intensity of men who had seen too much death to be moved by lies. Major Bill Barkworth and his team operated in a legal gray zone. The official Nuremberg trials were loud, public, and slow, but the SAS work was private and swift. They had converted a series of basements and requisitioned villas into temporary detention centers. Here, the former masters of Europe, the Gestapo officers and SS guards who had once strutted in polished boots, were now shivering in tattered coats, stripped of their rank and their arrogance. The interrogations were a battle of wills. The SAS men didn't always use physical force. Their greatest weapon was the dossier of the dead. They would sit across from a suspect and calmly lay out photographs of the exhumed bodies, the silk parachutes, and the personal effects found in mass graves. They would watch the suspect's eyes. When a Gestapo officer claimed he was only following orders or that he wasn't even in France at the time, the SAS would produce a captured German transport log or a signed execution warrant they had spent months tracking down. There was a profound irony in these rooms. The Nazi criminals were now begging for the protection of the very Geneva Convention they had denied to the SAS paratroopers. The tension was often at a breaking point. On several occasions, younger SAS soldiers, faced with the men who had tortured their friends, had to be held back by their superiors. The temptation to deliver battlefield justice, a bullet in a dark alley, was immense.
But Barkworth knew that a secret execution would only make his men like the monsters they were hunting. He wanted a different kind of justice, a full, recorded confession that would strip away the Nazi lie forever. One of the most intense moments occurred during the interrogation of an SS officer involved in the murder of Operation Leuthen members. For 3 days he denied everything. On the 4th night, Barkworth brought in a local French villager, a woman who had risked her life to bring water to the captured SAS men before they were shot. When she pointed her finger and described his face in the moonlight of the execution, the officer's facade finally crumbled. He didn't just confess, he began to name his accomplices in a desperate bid to save his own neck. Justice in the shadows was a lonely, grim business. There were no cameras, no juries, and no applause. It was just a few determined men in berets, making sure that the names of the lost patrols were the last things the killers heard before they were handed over to the military courts for hanging. The SAS were acting as the conscience of a nation that wanted to forget the war. They stayed in the dark so that the truth could finally walk in the light. By the time the unit was finished, they had secured enough evidence to convict dozens of high-ranking war criminals. They had proven that the Special Air Service never forgets a face, and they never, ever leave a brother behind.
By early 1946, the smoke from the ruins of the Third Reich had cleared, and the world was desperate to look forward, not back. The Nuremberg trials were making headlines, but away from the cameras and the legal grandstanding, the SAS War Crimes Investigation Team was reaching its final reckoning. Major Bill Barkworth and his men had spent months living like ghosts in the land of their enemies, and they had finally reached the end of their list. The reckoning was not just about catching men. It was about ensuring that the truth was recorded so firmly that no one could ever deny what happened in the woods of France and Germany. The SAS unit had successfully identified and captured dozens of key perpetrators, from the low-level guards who pulled the triggers to the high-ranking Gestapo officers who sat in comfortable offices and signed the death warrants. But as the unit prepared to hand over their evidence to the military courts, a new conflict emerged. The British government and the War Office were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Barkworth's private army. To the politicians, the SAS hunters were a reminder of a violent era they wanted to close. There were orders to disband the unit, to pack up the files, and to let the official channels take over. But Barkworth knew that official channels often meant that criminals would slip through the cracks of bureaucracy. Before they surrendered their authority, the SAS ensured that justice was finalized. They didn't just hand over names, they provided airtight cases that led to the Wuppertal and Hamburg trials. Because of their work, men like the Gestapo chief of the Vosges were walked to the gallows. They watched as the killers were led to the rope, not with the fire of revenge, but with the cold satisfaction of a mission accomplished. They had fulfilled the vow they made over the mass graves of their comrades. One of the most emotional moments of the final reckoning occurred when the team traveled back to England and France to meet the families of the missing. For 2 years, mothers and wives had been told only that their sons and husbands were missing in action. The SAS unit brought them the hardest kind of peace, the truth. They told them where their loved ones were buried and assured them that the men who had murdered them had faced a judge. It was a heavy, silent closure that no medal or parade could ever provide. In the end, the unit was quietly disbanded. There were no victory marches for the hunters of Operation Loyola. The men returned to civilian life, some becoming farmers, others businessmen, and some staying in the military.
They carried the secrets of their hunt with them, rarely speaking of the basements in Germany or the snatch squads in the Black Forest. The legacy of the final reckoning remains a cornerstone of the SAS creed. They proved that the bond of the regiment does not end when the bullets stop flying. They showed that for those who target the elite, there is no corner of the earth far enough to hide from the SAS. As the final files were locked away in the archives, the message was clear. The lost patrols were lost no more. They had been found, they had been honored, and their killers had been brought to account. The war was finally over, not because the treaty was signed, but because the debt had been paid in full.